There are moments in life that split time in two, moments so sharp, so irreversible, that everything before them feels like a different lifetime, and everything after carries a quiet scar. For me, that moment didn't come with shouting or sirens. It came with a sentence spoken casually in my kitchen. "Dad, you need to pay my husband's mortgage." No greeting, no warmth, no hesitation, just a demand, delivered the way someone asks for the salt. At first, I laughed, not because it was funny, but because my mind refused to accept what my ears had heard. My daughter had always been dramatic. I assumed this was another exaggeration, another emotional outburst that would soften once reality caught up. But her eyes didn't change. She crossed her arms, shifted her weight, and repeated it, slower this time, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "You have savings. You live alone. The house is almost paid off. What do you even need money for anymore?" That was when I felt it. Not anger, not disbelief, but something colder. Because in that moment, my entire life, every sacrifice, every skipped vacation, every night shift, every ache in my bones, was reduced to a balance sheet. I wasn't her father. I was a resource. Behind her, her husband leaned against the doorway, arms folded, expression carefully neutral, the kind of neutrality that hides calculation. I had buried my wife 10 years earlier, buried friends, buried dreams, buried youth itself, and I had done it willingly because everything I built for my daughter. I worked nights when my body begged for rest. I drove the same car until it coughed itself into silence. I stayed behind while others moved forward, all so she could sit in classrooms where children came from homes I would never afford. And now she stood in my kitchen and told me my life's work had no purpose beyond rescuing her husband from his own failures. I asked one question: why can't he pay it himself? She sighed loudly, the way someone sighs when they feel burdened by stupidity. Business is slow right now. Her husband didn't move, didn't speak. And if we lose the house, she continued, it'll be embarrassing. Embarrassing. Not hungry, not homeless, not desperate, just embarrassed. That was when I said no. Not loudly, not angrily, quietly, firmly, like a door closing without a slam. Her reaction was immediate. Tears, rage, accusations thrown like knives. She told me I was choosing money over her happiness. She told me a real father would do anything to protect his child. She told me I was punishing her for marrying a man I didn't trust. That last part wasn't even true. I had trusted him once. When I first met him, he was charming, ambitious, full of promises. He spoke about love and partnership and success just around the corner. He told me the mortgage was temporary pressure, bad timing, interest rates, investments on the horizon. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because believing him meant believing my daughter was safe. She stormed out of the house that day, slamming the door so hard the framed photo of my late wife fell from the wall and shattered on the floor. I remember kneeling to pick up the glass. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from realization. Love does not always grow gratitude. Sometimes it grows entitlement. The silence that followed, the days after, were worse than the confrontation itself. My phone rang constantly. Relatives, friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years, all calling to tell me how cruel I was, how selfish, how heartless. No one asked why a grown man needed his wife to pressure her aging father into paying his mortgage, and no one asked how it felt to live alone with arthritis, memories, and bills of my own. My daughter stopped visiting, blocked my number, unfollowed me online. She posted vague messages about toxic parents and emotional abuse. Strangers praised her strength without knowing a single fact that I stopped sleeping. At night, I replayed every moment of her childhood, searching for the mistake. Where had I failed? Had loving her without limits taught her that limits didn't exist? But somewhere between the loneliness and the shame, something changed inside me. Not into bitterness, into resolve. I decided I would not be bullied into financial ruin disguised as love. What I almost lost. I began quietly reviewing my finances. The rental property I still owned. The investments I had built slowly, cautiously. The paperwork I had signed years earlier to help her husband start his business. That was when I saw it. My name. On documents I didn't fully understand. Loans guaranteed with my credit. Business accounts tied to my identity. I sat in my living room staring at those papers like they might bite. I contacted a lawyer, not to attack, but to understand. What I learned made my blood run cold. If I paid that mortgage and his business failed, I wouldn't just lose savings. I would lose everything. My home, my retirement, my ability to care for myself in old age, all to protect a man who wouldn't even look me in the eye when asking for help. And suddenly, that quiet no I had spoken in my kitchen didn't feel cruel. It felt like survival. When desperation returns, months passed. Pressure grew. Then one evening my daughter returned. She looked thinner, panicked. This time, the tears were real. "Dad, please," she said. "This is the last notice. If you don't help us now, everything will collapse." I listened. Then I said something she didn't expect. "I'll consider helping, but only if everything is honest." She hesitated. Desperation makes people careless. She brought documents, loan statements, business records. And as I read, the truth unfolded like a slow disaster. The mortgage was double what she claimed. Her husband had taken additional loans against the house, without her knowledge. Business income had been diverted into risky ventures and personal expenses. And worse, her name was attached to debt she didn't understand. Debt that would follow her for decades. This was no longer about money. It was about truth. And truth, once uncovered, does not negotiate. I called a family meeting not because I wanted drama, but because silence had already done enough damage. Everyone who had called me heartless, everyone who had whispered about my cruelty, everyone who believed a version of the story that painted me as a villain, they came expecting me to finally give in, expecting tears or shouting or guilt. What they got instead was calm. I laid the documents on the table slowly, deliberately, and for the first time I spoke, without defending myself, I explained what paying that mortgage would actually mean. I explained how my daughter had been misled, how my name was tied to loans I never agreed to knowingly, how one payment would trigger obligations that could erase my future. I explained that this wasn't help, it was a trap. Her husband tried to interrupt, tried to spin the story back into emotion and urgency, and I stopped him with a sentence. "So quiet, it froze the room. If you speak again, I will contact the bank and dissolve every agreement tied to my name." Silence fell thick, heavy. My daughter stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Her anger drained away, replaced by confusion, then shock, then something far more painful, grief, the kind that arrives when love collides with truth. She finally understood that the man she trusted had gambled not just with money but with her future. I told her I loved her, but I would not destroy myself to protect lies. I told her I would help her get out, help her rebuild, help her heal, but I would not pay that mortgage. She screamed, said I had ruined her life, and I answered softly, "No, I saved it." Then I walked out of my own house, because sometimes strength looks like leaving the room before emotion takes control. The fallout was brutal. The marriage began to crack under the weight of exposed truth. Arguments replaced affection, suspicion replaced trust. The business collapsed under scrutiny. Unpaid taxes surfaced. Loans were called in. The house they begged me to save was sold, and my daughter disappeared from my life for nearly a year. During that time, I learned how loud silence can be. I learned how quickly people judge without facts and how rarely they apologize when the truth emerges. I went through my days on autopilot fixing things that didn't need fixing, just to stay busy. Neighbors asked about her, and I smiled, lied, said she was busy. Nights were the hardest. Memories flooded in uninvited. Her laughter as a child, her first school uniform, the night she cried because she thought I loved work more than her, and how I held her and promised she was my whole world. And now that world had turned its back on me. But silence sharpens the mind. Without her voice drowning out my thoughts, I started seeing patterns, red flags I ignored, moments I excused as harmless quirks, her husband's vague explanations, his big promises, and missing details. I remembered signing papers years ago, trusting reassurances that it was routine, just formalities. I dug through old files, pulled boxes from closets, dust coating my hands like proof of avoidance. Document by document, the truth became undeniable. My signature sat beneath guarantees. I barely remembered clauses that tied my future to a man who saw me as a safety net. That realization didn't break me, it focused me. I met my lawyer again, this time not confused but resolved. We mapped worst-case scenarios, timelines, risks, and I learned that if his business defaulted, creditors wouldn't knock politely. They would take everything they were entitled to, including my home, the one place that still carried my wife's presence. That was when anger finally arrived, not explosive, but controlled. I wasn't angry at my daughter, not fully. I was angry at myself for confusing love with compliance, for teaching her that my boundaries were flexible, that my sacrifice was infinite. Weeks later, the call came from a bank representative about missed payments linked to my name. My heart pounded, but my voice stayed steady. I told them all communication would go through my lawyer. That was the moment I knew refusing the mortgage had already saved me. The trap was closing, and I had stepped out just in time. The first public strike followed. Whispers dressed as concerned neighbors avoided eye contact. Relatives posted vague messages about selfish parents, sacrifice, and duty. My daughter still hadn't spoken to me, but she had spoken to everyone else, shaping a story where she was abandoned and I was cold. I attended a family gathering I hadn't planned to go to because hiding only makes lies louder. Conversations stopped. When I entered, forks froze, midair. Judgment pressed down on me, but I stood my ground. When someone finally asked why I refused to help my own child, I answered calmly, I refused to destroy myself to clean up another man's recklessness. Her husband laughed nervously, said business has ups and downs. I asked him in front of everyone to explain why 3 separate loans had been taken under my guarantee without my knowledge. The room shifted. He stumbled, looked to my daughter for rescue. She looked back, confused. Something cracked between them. Right there, I continued, stating facts, dates, amounts, signatures. The truth doesn't argue, it testifies. My daughter tried to stop me, accusing me of embarrassing her, and I said quietly, embarrassment is temporary. Bankruptcy is permanent. Silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable, and for the first time doubt replaced her anger. That night her husband called, tried threats, then guilt, told me I was tearing the family apart, said my daughter would never forgive me. I told him forgiveness is not currency, and hung up. Days later, he showed up alone, no charm, no audience, admitted mismanaging funds, blamed stress, expectations, love. I listened, then asked one question: if I sign this check today, what happens next year? He had no answer. That was enough. I told him to leave and not return. Without my lawyer, days later my daughter came, anger gone, replaced by exhaustion. She asked why I hadn't told her sooner, and I said I tried, but you didn't want to hear it. Love makes liars sound honest. She cried, quietly, not for show, and I did not hug her. I let the lesson settle, because comfort too early steals its power, and that was when everything truly changed. From that moment forward, I stopped reacting and started acting. Every move became deliberate, every silence intentional. My lawyer and I worked quietly, tracing liabilities, unwinding guarantees, isolating my assets from the sinking ship my daughter's husband had built on borrowed trust clauses I once skimmed, now read like traps narrowly avoided, because I had said no When it mattered, we filed motions to separate my name from future obligations, froze access to accounts tied to my credit, and formally notified banks that any transactions without my written consent would be treated as fraud. The response was immediate. Institutions move quickly when risk is exposed. Creditors closed in, deadlines tightened, phones that once rang with opportunity now rang with consequence. My daughter watched it all unfold, stunned, realizing how close she had come to losing everything, not just money, but herself. Her husband tried one final performance, accused me of manipulation, claimed I was turning her against him. I answered calmly with evidence, statements, timelines, signatures, numbers. Do not argue, they testify. Cornered by fact, stripped of narrative, he exploded, shouting that none of this would have happened if I had just paid the mortgage. And that sentence ended everything, because my daughter finally heard the truth. Not love, not partnership, just entitlement wrapped in panic. She asked him if that was all she was worth, a bailout. He had no answer. Again, silence crushed what remained of their marriage. Within weeks, separation papers were filed. Investigations followed. The business collapsed under audit, unpaid taxes, misrepresented earnings, undisclosed loans, all surfacing. Once blind faith was replaced by scrutiny. I stayed out of the spotlight. No victory laps, no celebration, just quiet precision. Relatives who once shamed me now avoided the topic entirely. Apologies came in fragments, awkward smiles, half sentences. I needed none. My daughter moved back temporarily, not as a dependent, but as someone rebuilding from ashes. We set boundaries. Respect, honesty. She attended financial counseling, learned how close she had come to generational ruin, and how easily love becomes a weapon when desperation meets denial. One evening, she sat across from me and said, "You didn't ruin my life, you saved it." And for the first time since that day in my kitchen, I felt peace, not relief, peace earned through endurance. Months later, life tested the lesson again. An associate from her past offered her fast money, easy profit, familiar promises. She came to me not asking permission, but asking perspective, and that difference told me everything. We talked about patterns, about how desperation always wears the mask of opportunity. She declined the offer, chose stability over illusion, and watching her make that choice without my fear, without my pressure, was a deeper reward than any financial recovery. Not everyone accepted the outcome. Some still whispered that a father should sacrifice everything regardless of consequence, but those voices faded as my life stabilized, and theirs did not. I stopped attending gatherings that demanded performance. Instead of peace, my circle grew smaller, but stronger. Solitude stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like freedom. The final encounter came unexpectedly in a grocery aisle. I ran into my former son-in-law, thinner, older, hollowed out. He muttered that I had ruined him. I answered calmly, "No, you ruined yourself when you mistook access for entitlement." He walked away, and I felt nothing, no anger, no triumph. Just closure. Years passed. My daughter rebuilt slowly, deliberately, honestly. She married again, much later, to a man who respected boundaries as much as affection. She asked me to walk her down the aisle, and as I did, I understood the full circle. Love had not been proven through sacrifice, but through restraint, through wisdom passed forward rather than wealth handed down. No headlines ever told this story, no applause marked the ending, but its power lives quietly in accounts, untouched in dignity, preserved in a daughter who learned that love does not demand self-erasure, and in a man who learned that revenge is not the fall of another, but the rise of oneself. Sometimes the bravest ending is simply standing still while chaos collapses around you, saying no without hatred, and choosing peace when everything else asks you to disappear. Time did not rush to reward us. It moved slowly, deliberately, testing whether the lessons learned were real or just scars pretending to be wisdom. Months turned into years, and life settled into something quieter, more honest. My daughter rebuilt peace by peace, credit restored, confidence earned, work chosen not for status, but for stability. She learned how to read contracts, how to ask hard questions, how to walk away from promises that sounded too good to be true, and each time she did I saw the echo of. That day in my kitchen transformed into something stronger. She no longer confused love with rescue, or loyalty with silence. She learned that boundaries are not walls, they are foundations, and watching that transformation healed parts of me I didn't know were still bleeding my own life. Simplified mornings began, without dread, no fear of unknown numbers flashing on my phone, no letters threatening what I owed, because I owed nothing. My house remained mine, the walls still carried memories of my wife, but now they felt like comfort instead of ghosts. I learned to enjoy the quiet, to sit without explaining myself to anyone, to understand that peace is not loneliness. When it is chosen relatives who once spoke loudly about sacrifice now spoke softly or not at all. Some tried to rewrite history, suggesting they had always supported me. I let them keep their illusions. I had no need to correct them. Clarity does not require witnesses. The final test came unexpectedly years later, when my daughter sat across from me one evening and asked a question that stopped time. She asked if I had ever hated her for what she did. I answered without hesitation, no. I hated the lie that taught you love meant taking from those who would never stop giving. She cried then, not from guilt, but release. And she thanked me not for the money I refused, but for the strength I showed when it cost me comfort. She said that refusal taught her how to protect herself in ways I never could with a check, and that was when I finally understood the truth. I had been searching for. This was never about revenge. It was about breaking a cycle that had quietly passed from generation to generation, where love was proven by loss and silence was mistaken for kindness. By saying no, I had not abandoned my daughter. I had given her something far more valuable than money. I had given her a future that did not depend on someone else's recklessness. Today my life is modest, secure, grounded. I still drink coffee alone in the mornings, but it no longer tastes bitter. My daughter visits, often not out of obligation, but choice. Our conversations are honest, sometimes uncomfortable, always real. When people ask about the hardest decision I ever made, I tell them it wasn't refusing to pay a mortgage, it was choosing to let the truth hurt now, so it wouldn't destroy us later. Sometimes love does not rescue, sometimes it refuses, sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do is stand still while a child walks through fire, knowing the pain will teach what protection never could. And sometimes the greatest revenge is not watching someone fall, but watching yourself and those you love rise free from the weight that was never yours to carry. The end, even after everything settled, life still found small ways to remind me how close I had come to losing it all. A letter from the bank years later, confirming accounts long closed, a random call meant for someone else that made my heart pause. Before I remembered there was nothing left to fear. Trauma does not vanish, it fades, and in that fading you learn what truly matters. I began volunteering quietly, helping people my age understand paperwork, contracts, finances, the things no one teaches until it's too late. I saw versions of myself in their confusion, the same trust, the same fear of saying no, and each time I told them the same thing: love that costs you your future is not love, it is a debt disguised as devotion. My daughter sometimes sat beside me during those sessions, listening more than speaking, and afterward she would say, I wish I had known this sooner, and I would answer gently, you know it now, and that is enough. Our relationship no longer rested on who owed whom, it rested on respect, which is far stronger and far rarer. She built a life that didn't need saving, and I built a life that didn't need defending. Years passed quietly, birthdays uncelebrated, headlines unwatched, no dramatic milestones, just consistency, which I learned is its own miracle. One afternoon she brought her child to my house, a small hand clutching mine as we walked through the same hallway where the photo once fell and shattered. She paused in front of that wall now bare and asked about her mother, about our past, about mistakes and lessons. And I realized the story had changed. It was no longer about loss, but about wisdom carried forward. I told her simply that love is strongest when it tells the truth, even when the truth hurts, even when it costs you comfort, because lies grow interest, and the bill always comes. Due as the sun set that evening, I sat alone. Again, but not empty, fulfilled. I understood then that my legacy was never money or property or sacrifice. It was the courage to stop a cycle before it claimed another generation. Sometimes the loudest love is refusal. Sometimes the deepest care is restraint. And sometimes the most powerful thing a parent can leave behind is not wealth, but the knowledge that self-respect is not selfish, it is survival, and that truth will outlive me long. After my house, my savings, and my story fade into silence. As age crept in quietly, I found myself thinking less about what I lost, and more about what was spared the future. I almost gave away the dignity I nearly traded for approval, the strength I didn't know I had until it was demanded of me. There were mornings when my joints ached and memories felt heavier than my body, but even then I woke without regret, because regret only grows where truth is avoided, and I had faced mine fully. People still tell stories about family loyalty, about sacrifice, as if destruction were proof of love, and I listen politely, but I no longer absorb those words. I have learned that loyalty without honesty is just fear wearing a moral costume, and sacrifice without consent is theft disguised as virtue. My daughter understands that now too. She teaches it to her child in small ways, not with speeches, but with example, by saying no without anger, by choosing stability over applause, by walking away from chaos, even when it promises excitement. One evening she told me something that stayed with me. She said, "When you refused to pay that mortgage, you became the first man in my life who loved me enough not to save me from the consequences of lies." And I realized then that the pain we endured had not been wasted. It had been transformed into wisdom, the kind that reshapes bloodlines. Not all wounds bleed, some educate. Not all losses take something away, some return something essential. I still keep the cracked photo frame, repaired now, placed back on the wall. My wife's smile, frozen in time, watching over a house that survived because I chose to protect it. And myself, sometimes I imagine what she would have said, and I know she would have understood. She always believed love should make you stronger, not smaller. My story does not end with triumph or applause. It ends with quiet certainty, the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. Sometimes the bravest thing you will ever do is disappoint someone you love to save them from a future built on illusion. Sometimes the line between love and self-destruction is a single word, spoken calmly, without apology, no. And sometimes that word echoes forward longer than any sacrifice ever could. In the years that followed, I stopped measuring my life by milestones and started measuring it by calm, by how often my shoulders stayed relaxed, by how rarely my heart raced at the sound of the phone, by how easily I could sit in silence without needing to justify my existence to anyone. That calm was not accidental. It was built from every boundary, held every apology. I never demanded every explanation. I refused to give people who had already chosen their version of the story my daughter grew into herself, not the version shaped by fear or pressure or performance, but the one that makes steady choices when no one is watching. She learned to ask better questions, to pause before agreeing to anything that required her to disappear. And when she stumbled, she owned it, quickly corrected course, and moved forward without shame, because shame had lost its power over her. We spoke openly about money, about trust, about how love can be real and still be wrong, and those conversations did more for our bond than any check ever could. There came a day when she asked me something quietly while we washed dishes together. She asked if I had ever thought about giving in just to keep the peace. I smiled and told her the truth. Peace that requires your destruction is not peace, it is postponement. She nodded and said she finally understood that peace is built, not purchased, and I knew then the lesson had landed fully. Sometimes old friends still bring it up, half joking, half probing, asking if I would do it differently, knowing how much pain it caused, and I always give the same answer: I would do it sooner. Pain delayed only compounds the interest, and families pay the highest rates when honesty is avoided. I do not regret the silence that followed my refusal, because it made room for something better: respect, clarity, and a love that does not ask for proof. Through suffering my house remains modest, unchanged. The walls carry stories, not debts. The garden grows slowly like everything worth keeping. And when I sit on the porch in the evenings watching the light fade, I think about how close I came to losing all of it by confusing love with obligation, and how one word said without anger changed the direction of multiple lives. This story will never be taught in schools. It won't trend or win applause, but it will live quietly in the choices my daughter makes and the choices her child will one day make. And that is enough, because the greatest inheritance is not money saved or property owned. It is the courage to say no when yes would cost you everything, and to trust that real love will survive the truth even when it trembles at first. Sometimes the strongest legacy a parent leaves is the example of standing firm without cruelty, choosing survival without bitterness, and walking forward without looking back, knowing that peace earned honestly is worth more than approval bought with self-erasure. And that is where my story rests, not in victory or loss, but in quiet earned freedom. Freedom has a sound when you finally recognize it. It is not loud, it does not announce itself. It sounds like an ordinary morning where nothing is demanded of you and nothing is owed. I began to notice it in small moments, choosing what to eat without rushing, choosing where to sit without guilt, choosing when to speak and when silence was enough. Those choices were once luxuries I couldn't afford when my worth was measured by what I was willing to give up. Now they were simply mine. My daughter noticed it too. She said, "You seem lighter," and I told her, "That is what happens when you stop carrying weight that was never yours." She smiled, not sadly, not apologetically, but with understanding, the kind that comes only after you've lived through the consequence of not understanding. We stopped revisiting the past, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer controlled us. When it surfaced, it did so as reference, not wound, a lesson, not a weapon. There is a quiet pride in watching someone you love choose better without needing you to intervene. It means you did something right, even if it hurt at the time. Her child grew curious about the world, asking why people make bad choices, why adults lie, why money changes people. And we answered honestly, not harshly, not cynically, but clearly. We taught that mistakes are part of living, but refusing to see them is a choice that costs more than money ever will. I taught that help is a gift, not an obligation, and that love is strongest when it does not erase the self. The family learned to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it, to ask what is true before asking what is easy, and that habit quietly reshaped everything. Holidays became simpler gatherings, smaller laughter, more genuine. No one performed gratitude, no one tallied sacrifices. We shared what we had and stopped apologizing for what we didn't. As years settled in, I sometimes thought about the man I was before that sentence in my kitchen, how ready I was to give up everything to avoid being misunderstood, and I felt compassion for him. He didn't lack love, he lacked permission to protect himself. Now I grant that permission freely to others and to myself. If there is a moral, it is not dramatic. It is practical. Love that demands your disappearance is not love, it is fear. Negotiating terms, real love allows you to stay whole even when it is disappointed, even when it is challenged, even when it must wait. This is not a story about money or mortgages or revenge. It is a story about choosing truth when silence would be easier, choosing boundaries when guilt would be rewarded, choosing a future that does not require you to vanish so others can feel comfortable. And when I look back at the moment that split my life in two, I no longer see loss. I see the beginning of honesty. The first day I stopped living as a resource and started living as a person, and that choice continues to pay dividends no market could ever measure, not in applause, not in approval, but in the steady, unshakable peace of knowing I did not save a lie, and in refusing to do so, I saved something far more important, myself and everyone who came after me. There are nights when memory still tests me, when the house is quiet and the past taps gently, asking if I am sure, if I ever doubted myself, if I wondered whether a different choice would have been easier. And the answer is honest. Yes, I doubted myself many times, but doubt is not failure. It is the price of thinking deeply, of refusing to move blindly just because love tells you to close your eyes. Doubt kept me awake, but it also kept me alive. It forced me to ask questions when obedience would have been praised, and that is a trade I will make every time. I learned that guilt is loud but temporary, while consequences are quiet and permanent. The world applauds sacrifice without asking who pays the bill later, and families are often where that bill is sent unseen and unpaid until it destroys someone quietly. I refused to be that someone, and in doing so, I taught my daughter that she did not need to be either. She once told me she feared becoming like her mother, losing herself completely in service and love, and I told her love should add to you, not erase you. Her mother gave everything because she believed that was what love required, but even she deserved more, and I believe she would be proud that the cycle stopped here, that her daughter learned to give without disappearing and to receive without demanding destruction from others. I carry that belief gently, like a promise kept. The future arrived without drama, no sudden redemption arcs, no applause, just steady days built on truth and mutual respect. My daughter learned to sit with uncertainty without running to rescue or be rescued. Her child learned by watching, not lecturing, and I learned to rest without fear of being judged for it. Sometimes strangers still tell stories about parents who gave everything and lost it all, and they expect admiration, but I listen with a quiet sadness, because giving everything should not mean ending with nothing left of yourself. Love should not require self-extinction, and when people ask what I would tell someone facing the same demand, the same pressure, the same manipulation dressed as family duty, I tell them this: pause, read everything, ask questions, and remember that love that punishes you for saying no is not love. You are allowed to survive. You are allowed to age with dignity. You are allowed to protect what you built, even from the people you love, most especially from them, if necessary, because one day those boundaries may be the very thing that saves them too. The story does not close with a lesson shouted from rooftops. It closes with a life lived more honestly than before, with mornings that arrive without fear, with relationships that breathe instead of demand, and with a legacy that will never be written down, but will be felt every time my daughter chooses clarity over chaos, and every time her child learns that love is not measured by how much you are willing to lose, but by how much truth you are willing to carry forward. And that is where this story finally rests, not as a warning or a victory, but as a quiet reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to disappear, even for the people you love most, and trust that real love will find its way back when the noise fades and the truth is allowed to stand on its own. As the years passed, the quiet grew into its own presence. It was not emptiness, it was clarity. I no longer woke with dread when the phone rang or when letters arrived. I no longer flinched at reminders of what could have been lost. I had stepped aside from the chaos at the perfect moment, and that refusal had not only saved me, it had reshaped the path of everyone involved. My daughter, once convinced that love meant taking, learned that love sometimes means watching, guiding, and letting lessons arrive unfiltered by rescue. She grew into a woman who could see opportunity without being blinded by charm, who could weigh risk without letting fear dominate, who could love without erasing herself. And when she made choices, she made them deliberately, and I learned to trust her discernment. I watched her from the quiet corners of our lives, the choices she made in work, in friendship, in love. She no longer rushed for validation or sought applause. She built slowly, carefully, authentically. I felt a pride that had nothing to do with praise and everything to do with the knowledge that a dangerous lesson had been internalized safely. My own days were slower, more deliberate. I took my coffee, walked in my garden, fixed things that didn't need fixing just because it grounded me. I spoke to those around me about the dangers of silent compliance and the power of saying no. Young people, older neighbors, anyone willing to listen, they all seemed to carry a piece of that lesson forward. Time solidified the truth. Strength is quiet, and survival is its own victory. I no longer waited for recognition or understanding from those who had judged me harshly. Their opinions had weight once, but now they were just echoes of misunderstanding. The only measure of right was in the calm that filled my home, in the respect in my daughter's eyes, in the peace that allowed us to share space without fear, without obligation. And then came the small, profound moments that reminded me this was never about money. The day my daughter brought her own child to me, walking hand in hand through the same hallways that had witnessed past storms, I saw the cycle I had feared broken. The child asked questions, simple and unafraid. Why do adults lie? Why do people demand what isn't theirs? And we answered, not with anger, not with lectures, but with honesty. Lessons passed forward, boundaries respected, integrity preserved. I realized that survival had become inheritance, and that by refusing to vanish for love, I had given something far greater than wealth, a model for life. No one applauded us, no headlines celebrated the ordeal, and no one understood fully how delicate the balance had been. But I felt it in the slow growth of my daughter into someone unafraid to say no, in her child learning the difference between kindness and exploitation, in the quiet satisfaction of living a life measured by truth rather than obligation. And that is the final lesson. Sometimes the loudest, most powerful victories are unseen. They are not dramatized. They are lived. Love is not measured by what you surrender, but by what you protect. And sometimes the bravest act is simply standing still when the world demands your collapse, saying no without apology, and trusting that real love, the kind that lasts, will survive the truth. This was never about a mortgage. This was about life, about dignity, about teaching a daughter that love, when real, does not demand destruction. And in that quiet, deliberate refusal, we all survived.